Shameez Patel Papathanasiou is a South African author working as a civil engineer by day and writing fantasy by night. Her literary adventures take her to worlds filled with magic, monsters, and someone to fall in love with. Her debut novel, The Last Feather, is a threat and danger hidden world fantasy, and today you will be hearing from, I believe, book 2. Shameez, take it away.
That's right. Hi, I'm Shameez Patel Papathanasiou, and I'll be reading from The Eternal Shadow, which is the second book in the Selene trilogy. The scene I'm about to read takes place after Cassia Khan is abducted from our world, and she's taken to the Selene realm to be the king's personal healer. But as she arrives at the ball he's hosting, she sees Prince Lachlan, the unlikely ally who had helped her save her sister and best friend, Lucas. But he also happens to be the son of the cruelest man. The music danced across her skin, and her knees wobbled as she tried to make sense of everything happening around her. The observer, Finn, tugged on her elbow, pulling her toward the center of the hall. The slit in her dress split as she tried to keep up with him, and she was acutely aware of how much skin she was showing. She rarely showed any. When Lachlan came into view, she stumbled, and Finn drew her to her feet. Even so, she didn't care to look at the ground she nearly slammed against. She was lost in his eyes, his bright blue eyes, the ones she'd often dreamed about, and they were wide with a fear that reflected her own. Her magic swirled, fought to get out of her, and the observer let go of her hand and stared down at his reddened palm. "What did you do?" he asked. She tore her gaze away from Lachlan to frown at the observer. She hadn't done anything. She turned back to Lachlan, catching the muscle in his jaw fluttering as he looked at her and stole a glance at his father. But the king's terrifyingly blue eyes, so similar to Lachlan's and yet entirely different, were also fixed on her. He scanned her from head to toe, his smile slowly growing, a smile nothing like his eldest son, but exactly like the other. Prince Cain gestured toward her and looked at Lachlan, whose expression had changed to a mask of nonchalance. Cain stood, and while he was tall, he didn't take up much space, but he walked as if he intended to, pushing his way through the crowd of firsts, with an unappealing look of determination on his weak face. The guests moved aside, but if they lingered a second too long, he elbowed them out of the way. Cassia waited. The very least she would do was make him come to her. But before Cain could lay his filthy hands on her, Lachlan teleported to her side. He and his brother were both wearing the same black military-style tailcoat with gold button detailing, which matched the embroidery on the maroon vest they wore underneath. The cloak he always wore was draped across his shoulders. He didn't touch her, but his eyes seemed to scan her for injuries, meeting her gaze and speaking volumes. "Prince Lachlan," he said, lowering his head, and the light scattered off the jewels in his crown. "And you are?" he asked, as his brother reached them. Her heart fluttered with excitement at the familiarity of someone who knew she wasn't meant to be here, with a fear of what he might do. "Cassia Khan," she said, her voice a squeak of what it used to be. "Your Highness," she added with a small curtsy. "You clean up nicely," the younger of the princes said, his smile twisting something unpleasant in her stomach. "Shall we open the floor with a dance?" He extended his hand, and Lachlan swatted it away. "I'll take the first dance. As the crown prince, it is my right, provided father isn't interested." Lachlan looked over his shoulder to where the king sat. Now, boys. Our healer isn't here to entertain the two of you. We have other guests for that," he said, his lips tilting upward in something that should be called a smile and yet felt nothing like it. "Every party starts with a dance, father," Lachlan said, avoiding her gaze, "and I suspect she's your grand finale, and you won't be needing her until then." "You know me well, boy." Cassia's skin crawled at the laid-back tone being used. "May I?" Lachlan asked, bowing and raising his hand before her. If at that moment she could fit her entire body in the palm of his hand, she would have, and yet she couldn't bring herself to touch him. He lifted his head and laughed lightly. "It's either me or my brother over there, fiery little lady, and I have a feeling you'd prefer me." Her breath hitched at the familiar nickname that she'd initially disliked, but now it comforted her. A private message, giving her the boost she needed to rest her hand in his. The second their skin touched, The heat from his hand, hot against her already warm skin, sent a shiver to her very core. "I'll lead," he said in a voice so low it dropped to the bottom of her stomach. All eyes turned to face them as Lachlan led her to the center of the hall. She'd expected a waltz, but he pulled her against him with what she thought was more force than he intended. Her chest bumped against his. His deep gaze dropped to her cleavage for a second. "No necklace," he said to himself, followed by a string of curses. She felt his flaming hand slip to the small of her back, and she reached up to rest her hand on his jacketed shoulder, nervously fiddling with the embellishments. As soon as the band started playing a new song and the music drowned out the noise of the chatter and clinking around them, he whispered, "What are you doing here?" His face was expressionless. Even though his tone was hard, the smell of vanilla radiating from him made her almost dizzy, wanting to lean into it and be transported to another time, another moment. Stepping along with him, she scowled. "Do you think I want to be here?" She forced a smile as he spun her around. The firsts watched them, half interested, drinks in one hand, food in the other. "Are you okay? Did they hurt you?" "No," she whispered, hesitating as she thought of Kane touching her, squeezing her against the wall, his tongue, his roaming hands. A low growl escaped Lachlan as if he'd read her mind. She felt it in the vibration of his chest against hers before he stepped away, elegantly moving to the music in a way she had not expected him to. "Nothing I couldn't handle," she added. Pulling her back toward him, he twirled her around until her back met his chest. He lowered his head to her neck, where his hot breath heated up even further. "I can't get you home without a feather necklace, but I can take you to Lucas," he whispered in her ear, his lips trailing her skin. She had known that without a necklace, she would be trapped in the Celine realm, but hearing Lachlan say it sent her spiraling. If he hadn't been holding her, she'd have fallen over. Turning around slowly within the smooth beat of the music, he guided her across the dance floor, and as if floating, she moved along with him, their movements in sync as their eyes scanned the surroundings. "No," she mouthed, and he pulled her close, giving her a chance to explain herself. "If I escape now, they'll kill my family," she said, and the mask he wore cracked for a microsecond before it was replaced with a perfectly flawless look of arrogance and pride, reminding her that he was still the king, the prince of the first. "Perhaps you could warn my family first, move them somewhere, and then come back for me." He spun her out and dipped. The rush of blood to her head made the entire situation seem as though it were happening in her imagination. When he lifted her back up, his mouth lowered to her neck and her head fell back. Her skin prickled pleasantly against his lips, and she wondered why her body was reacting to him at a time like this. "I'll figure something out," he whispered. And as his mouth reached her ear, he added in a low voice, "And I'll kill Kane for bringing you here." Lachlan's palm trailed her arm as he stepped backwards, creating space between them until his hands joined hers. The music wound down, and he raised their joined fingers before bowing deeply at the waist. Cassia glanced over at him, finding him flashing that perfect smile. She curtsied, mimicking his smile, and the audience cheered. Without letting go, he led her back to the dais. Her heart beating fast, her palms clammy with heat and adrenaline. Her skin, like his, glistened with sweat from the movement from the overly warm room. "You're a dancer," the king said as they approached. "What a lovely treat." He wet his bottom lip before his face fell into the crooked smile he wore with ease. The long scars left by Rolog stretched across the one side of his face, and Cassia found herself wishing Rolog had finished the job, devoured him entirely. This was the man who abducted children and abused reborns and guests. Thank you.